Hi everybody, I would like to welcome you for week 2 of our course MT535 Theology of Suffering and Joy. We start the lecture with the reading of this week, which is depicting one of the darkest moments of humanity's history. If you can, and I would like to really encourage you, take the time to read the whole book of Elie Wiesel, Night, where he describes his experiences with his father in the Nazi German concentration camp in Auschwitz and in Buchenwald during the period of 1944 and 45, which of course was the height of the Holocaust towards the end of the Second World War. A historical context that brought out great despair and human suffering, which brought this young teenage boy to the point where he writes in the book about his father that he dearly loves, saying, quote, "If I could only get rid of his dead weight." Immediately I felt ashamed of myself, ashamed forever. End of quote. Elie Wiesel experienced unimaginable evil. Arriving in Auschwitz, Wiesel and his father were selected to go to the left, which means forced labor, while his mother and sisters were selected to go right. He writes, quote, "Man to the left, woman to the right." 8 words spoken quietly, indefinitely, without emotion. 8 short, simple words. For part of a second I glimpsed my mother and my sister moving away to the right. Zibora held my mother's hand. I saw them disappear into the distance. My mother was stroking my sister's fair hair. And I did not know that in that place, at that moment, I was parting from my mother and Zibora forever. End of quote. In the end, Wiesel lost everything. His little sister, his mother, his father, his dignity, his religion, even God. He notes there was nothing left, no strength even for lamenting. Yet in the end, he notes, we begin again with the night. Wiesel had to rethink humanity, rethink about his own religion and beliefs. He had to rethink about God. He once remarked, quote, "I think of the killer and I lose all faith. But I think of the victim and I am inundated with compassion." End of quote. Suffering changes us. I still vividly remember when my wife experiences the 2 miscarriages. From the first moment when she miscarried during a missional trip we were in China, from that moment on, every time when we had to go to the doctor, anxiety and fear just followed us. Suffering or loss at that time started to totally change us and brought a lot of difficult questions to us about life and death. Of course, nothing like the experience that Wiesel had to go through. But having experienced some kind of suffering and seeing a lot of suffering with those that we ministered, this started to change immensely in how I do theology today and in how I do mission, in how I engage missionally. I started to really reflect on that and started to do theology in that context of a suffering world, in my wounds, and of course also in Christ's wounds, in the face of pain. When Christ met after the resurrection, when he met his disciples again, the mothers, his sister and all of those, he did not come back with no wounds on his hands and on his bodies, but they were there. They were a reminder of where they went through. I remember when I watched the movie The Shack, and which was a very powerful movie about loss and suffering and pain and forgiveness. And I read an interview with the author of the book, where the movie comes from, and they asked him, what would you change from your book and from the movie? And he said, only one scene. And that scene where the blood is on the floor. And he talks about that, like the wounds, the blood or the wounds, the pain, they are still there in our lives, of him losing his daughter. But even they are there, they don't have a grip anymore on us in that context. But when I think about that, doing theology, I think about that brokenness, that vulnerability, and that woundedness we have, and the importance that we do theology from that context of, because we experience the cross and the hope of the resurrection at the same time. And we will talk about what that means, that we don't do just on one or the other, but how to complement those each others and be aware of that, how important that is when we do theology and when we do engage missionally with the other, that we are aware of that we know the context that we work, that we know the wounds that are there, and that we work towards that hope that we have in the gospel that has been given to us. We will explore that later in this course. What does it mean to do theology and mission in those contexts? And what does it mean to do engage with a suffering and a broken world from a holistic and sound and discerning biblical approach? But for now, we get there. For now, I would like to start to focus us first and to start to reflect deeper about the evil and the suffering in the world. Let us lay a foundation on that where we can start building upon it. And I would like to start with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He lived during the time of 1646 to 1716. And what he has pointed out is that there are three forms of evil. There is the metaphysical evil, the malum metaphysicum. Then there is the natural evil, malum physicum. And there is the moral evil, malum moral. So the metaphysical evil points towards the human imperfection. So it is, however, not a great problem inasmuch as something created and necessary different from God must be incomplete. So only diversity of creation allows her freedom and her own stand before God. Now, the malum physicum, which is natural evil, contains the essential essence of our constitution, and the malum moral, the moral, are those of those evils which are due to our own fault and wrong behaviors. Now, in this lecture, I will provide some thoughts about the natural law, theodicy, so natural evil, and then the next weeks we will look into more the moral evil, where we examine different theodicies that try to answer those questions. Now, to start that conversation, I would like to do an example between moral and natural evil. And I like to share the example of Nathaniel West's novel, which is entitled Miss Lonely Hearts, which was printed in 1933. And at the center of that novel is a young journalist that writes a column with the name Miss Lonely Hearts that basically responds to letters from readers that are filled with stories of suffering. And one of those short letters, he writes the following, quote, "Dear Miss Lonely Hearts, I am 16 years old and do not know what to do. I would be glad if you could tell me what to do. When I was little, I was still there because I got used to the fact that the children from my neighborhoods were making fun of me. But now I want to have friends like the other girls and go out on a Saturday night. But no one wants to go out with me because I have no nose from birth. I dance well, I have grown well, my father buys me pretty clothes. I sit there all day looking at me and crying. In the middle of my face I have a large hole which frightens people, also myself. I understand why the boys would not want to go out with me. My mother loves me, but she cries awfully when she looks at me. What I have done to deserve this fate? Even when I was something bad, but not all before I was 1 year old, and I am born without a nose. I ask my father, and he says he does not know either. He thinks that I have done something in the other world before I was born, or perhaps I am being tortured for his sin. But I do not think that, because he's very nice. Should I commit suicide? Best regards, end of quote. The case of congenital malformation describes here obviously a typical example of natural evil. Yet quite interesting, as the story shows, natural evil is sometimes interpreted as a moral failure of a person. The father told his daughter, quote, he thinks that I have done something in the other world before I was born, or perhaps I am being tortured for his sin, end of quote. Nevertheless, let us look a little closer now at the problem of natural evil, natural laws and theodicies. And we'll look again later in the course some interpretive frames on moral evil and how that sometimes is used for natural evil. But when we look at natural evil and natural laws and try to explain that, the exploration of nature reveals an astonishing and complexity and fascinating order. When we look at the world, it's just amazing when we look at the details of it. The physical structure of the universe is a complicated system of constant parameters and natural law. The development and the existence of life and consciousness were possible because all of these bodies are precisely coordinated with each other. Only a tiny changes would have made life impossible. The molecular biological structure of a single cell shadows any kind of artifacts in terms of complexity and functionality. Just think about the human brain. Furthermore, Bruce Reichenbach also provides some interesting argumentation of the theodicy when it comes to natural laws. He attempts to defend God's existence in the face of natural evil by appealing to a morally sufficient reason for the existence of evil. According to his view, God must have morally sufficient reason for allowing natural evil that makes it inappropriate to assign God any blame. Reichenbach accepts the atheist contention that without a morally sufficient reason, one could not reasonably accept the existence of an all-good and all-powerful God. Accordingly, he searches for some facts about the existence of natural evil and God's causality of the natural world, which protects God from blame and preserves his perfect goodness. Reichenbach sees natural evil as the unintended consequence of the world operating according to natural laws. And these natural laws, in turn, are necessary for there to be free moral agents. That God wills free moral agents which we'll explore in more detail in the free will theodicy, is likewise necessary because a world without them is inferior to a world with them. Given that God wills to have free moral agent, then he must also will the world to operate according to natural laws, which results in natural evils. So the only alternative world operated by natural laws is a world operated by miracle. But such a miracles world would not allow for the existence of free moral agent and a significant existence of the freedom. So in Reinbach's theodicy, he hangs on this change of necessity, which holds God to having to allow natural evil in order to have free moral agents, which he is also bound to do. Of course, the weakness of Reinbach's theodicy is that natural law, he sacrifices God's omnipotence. He assumes that God is bound by necessity to create free moral agents. Now, Church Father Thomas Aquinas provides, in my opinion, a more comprehensible approach by considering natural evil as a result only from things external to the victim of natural evils, throughout obeying natural laws. So rather for Aquinas, natural evil includes natural disasters, but also results from the very nature of things as materials. So the prevention of natural evil is possible for Aquinas precisely because God is omnipotent. But his failures to do so would not entail God is less than all good. Aquinas states, quote, "This is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good." End of quote. So a natural law theodicy basically justifies God from natural evil because the existence of natural evil is entailed by natural laws. And a world without natural law would be a much worse world. In this week reading that you're doing from Terence Freitman, where the book is entitled Creation Untamed, the Bible, God and Natural Disaster, he notes, for example, that natural disasters are an integral part of God's design in creation. If you want to explore further into that whole topic of natural disaster and natural law, that book will be a good start. Terence Freitman gives us insight into what kind of world we are living in. He points out that the creation is good, but that does not mean that it is perfect. While at the same time to say that God's creation is not perfect is not to say that moral evil makes it imperfect. We live in a universe that reflects God's glory and beauty, which would not exist without suffering and pain. Reading in Genesis 3 verses 1 to 6 notes that, quote, "the tree of knowledge of good and evil," end of quote. And therefore, for some have argued that evil was already part of that world. Satan was in paradise, but still paradise was good. The creation is good because it reflects His possibility for its intended purposes. Creation is a witness to the Creator, who is good. Or as some others have noted, that natural evil is not evil per se. It is basically a function of the world of time. In that sense, only moral evil is truly evil. Surely many raised question that if God is God, why would He not create a better world? No more disasters, no more pain, no more suffering. Yet anybody who took time to understand the universe realizes how incredible it is put together, of the many forces and properties which allow it to exist in the place. Paul Davies calls it the Goldilocks enigma, showing that astonishing number of, quote, coincidences which must, end of quote, which must occur together for the universe itself to emerge and for life to emerge from it. Here are a few examples from his book. Quote, right at the beginning of creation, matter and antimatter were formed in almost equal amounts. In a milliseconds of time, the universe cooled enough for quarks and antiquarks to condense out. If a quartz met an antiquark, they will cancel each other out. An exact symmetry would seem to be the most likely outcome. But in fact, for every billion quarks and antiquarks, there was one extra quark. That infinitesimal fraction of the potential served to make up the entire universe as we know it. If there has been an exact symmetry, the universe would have ended in pure radiation and no galaxies, stars or planets could have been formed. Second, the expansion of the universe in the first moment of the Big Bang took its mass from a microscopic but almost infinite dense mass to a vast and almost infinite extension. Space was thus created and time began. This is mind-blowing in itself. The entire universe was contained in a mass smaller than a golf ball. End of quote. We could go on exploring the universe that leaves us astonished on this incredible coincidence that created a stable universe capable of sustaining complex life forms. It is understandable that we might question God while not creating a better world, but then we never fully comprehend this universe and the complexity behind creation that makes it just right for life. Any small changes would not make life possible. Clearly the psalmist is right proclaiming, quote, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. End of quote. Psalm 19 verse 1. The world is beautiful and good, and at the same time it's flawed and spoiled in many ways. Suffering in our world is a constant reminder that we live in a world that is good but not perfect. A world that reflects both the obedience and the disobedience of God's will. All new life comes out of pain, and it's part of the created order. New life does not come to this world without pain and suffering. Even before the fall, God said, I will multiply your pain in childbirth. God made it this way. So even there was a good world, pain was part of it. We know that in our own life, when we are creating something, pain is often something that comes along it, a fellow companion. Anybody who has written a paper for a class or even a whole book knows how much pain and even suffering sometimes goes into that. In our ministries, how often are we moved by a deep vision that takes us to carry unbelievable much of us, where we start to, where we are moved, where sacrifices and experience of suffering we take on us so that we can birth that vision that are in our hearts for the ministries. Sometimes cost us our blood, tears, but often when what we create with God's grace is beautiful. There goes a familiar saying, if it costs something, it brings greater meaning to what we are creating. C.S. Lewis' book, the problem of pain, is a space where he reflects on the loss of his dear wife and points out that suffering is really something sometimes we need to go through. Louis refers suffering to a visit like a dentist. And I'm personally really scared to go to a dentist even today. But during his days, there was no anesthesia. He points out that sometimes we just need to go through it. Sometimes we need to embrace suffering to make sure we do not experience greater suffering. I vividly remember having to go with my 6-year-old daughter to the dentist to pull an infected tooth. She clearly didn't want to go through that suffering, but going through this pain in the end brought greater healing to her infection, was making sure that the infection would not spread. Or have you ever tried to reason out with a child that the vaccine shot is good for them? Or from a different perspective, we could ask ourselves, why is it morally okay to have a child if we know that the child will experience pain and suffering and for certainly death at the end of life? Normally a decision that involves somebody's death will be, of course, morally be questionable. Why then is it okay? I think one of the reasons is because the child would not have existed. When we think of this world with all the suffering and pain, we need to be reminded that we are part of it. If anything changes, we will not exist. In that sense, small changes, even as small as a second cell, can change the earth the way that we know it. Would the earth be better with less natural disasters? My trust is in Scripture, and that when God created the earth and saw what He has done each day, He noted it was good. Discerning the good in our world, especially in a context of suffering and evil, is very difficult to do. We are often blind in our context, and we need to we need God to open our eyes. Discerning the good in situation is a spiritual discipline that we need to develop. For I was blind and now I see. There is a deep joy found in God's goodness. Probably all of us has experienced some of this beauty. When you visit me in Switzerland, you will see the Swiss mountains. When I was in Asia and the Philippines, the beautiful oceans, the flowers, the landscape. So as we develop a theology of joy, we do it alongside the theology of creation. The good God has put us in our world and alongside the fallen nature. To sum up, there are different ways to look at natural evil. Whether we are aware of it or not, we all cling to the belief or the longings that the world that we live in is orderly and that life and everything has a meaning, a purpose. Suffering and evil truly can shatter that conviction. And as we will hear many stories in the next week, so we need to be equipped with tools and wisdom in how appropriately engage the suffering and evil in this world. So starting next week, we will look at 7 different theological and theoretical approach of theodicy. The primary focus of this theodicy are on moral evil, but of course some will have relation explain natural evil too. For example, the soul-making theodicy talks about natural evil being an inevitable byproduct of God's aim to develop the moral character of humans. Or when we look at process theology, noting that natural evil exists because of the imperfection of nature, having been created and being sustained by a God who limits himself to persuasion. When we examine the cosmic theodicy, we'll see how that theodicy will blame the demonic forces for natural evil as they opposed the will of God's creation. That tornado was sent by Satan, and so you have to pray against it. We'll look at those things. So these different theodicies provide different perspectives and roadmaps that help us understand better suffering and evil in this world. We will critically engage with these ideas and perspective that hopefully help us to build a missiology of joy that absorbs suffering and enables us to faithfully live in the midst of evil, where we share and receive the true source of true joy, which is found in God's person, His work, His provision, His rule, and His presence. Thank you for listening for this week's lecture, and I look forward to be hearing from you and engaging with you.